Well, that may have been treated a bit more flippantly than most of the children's stories about the fall of Jericho. But it really captures how I think most of us have come to think of this incredible story as the first marching band concert in history that brought down the house, literally. All right, you might not have pictured a bass drum in there before. I had never before I saw that. But for the most part, I think this is what we have in mind, right? A few soldiers tooling around the city a few times until they shout and the walls collapse. But not only is that not an accurate picture, but I think it tends to steal from us the significance of what was going on in this story, both for the Israelites and the inhabitants of Jericho. So I want to spend a few moments today taking a step back with you and examining the importance of the story of Jericho and what it says about the kind of person God is. So first of all, let's try to get something other than a cartoon picture in our heads. Let's start with Jericho. Although this was probably the best fortified city in the Promised Land, it was by no means large. Certainly not by modern standards. Archaeological excavations have revealed that altogether it comprised about 10 acres. So the city wasn't massive, but it was big enough to have a king and a few thousand inhabitants. And even though Jericho wasn't that big, it had massive walls. The first, a stone retaining wall that sat on top of a steep embankment that fell off and went down. That first wall was about 12 to 15 feet high. On top of that retaining wall stood another wall made of mud bricks, which was about 26 feet high and about 6 feet thick. Together, these two walls combined to form a fortified wall that was about 40 feet high. And that was just the outer wall. Once inside this wall, the embankment continued to rise upward, and at the top of it, there was another mud brick wall that formed the wall of the actual city. And it was 6 feet high. So to anyone standing at ground level, the top of the walls of Jericho would have towered 10 stories above them. Jericho may not have been a sprawling city, but it was a massive city, impenetrable, or so it seemed. In contrast to this city, with the rather smallish footprint, was the fighting force of the Israelites. In Joshua chapter 4, it is recorded that 2.5 of the Israelite tribes provided 40,000 soldiers alone for the army. So if the other tribes were contributing comparable regiments, the whole Israelite army would have numbered about 200,000 men. That's a lot of people. That means even if they had marched in ranks of 100 soldiers deep at 3-foot intervals, the procession would have stretched for over a mile. Now we may safely assume that the soldiers didn't march right next to the walls, because not only would they have wanted to be beyond the reach of arrows or rocks or any other weapons, but the sheer number of people involved would have forced them to march at a distance. Regardless, when they surrounded the city, it was surrounded. And that's exactly how much of the warfare was accomplished in those days, by siege. Sure, you could put up your walls like a fortress around your city, but if your enemy came and put up a stronger wall around your walls and stayed there long enough, you wouldn't be able to come in and go out. Food would eventually start to run out, and you'd be stuck in a jail whose walls had been built by you. Jericho was surrounded by massive walls, but suddenly it was surrounded by another massive wall of people. I can't imagine how terrifying that must have been the first day when the Israelites marched around the city while the priests were blowing the ram's horn trumpets. Now these were the instruments the shofar. Now the shofar is not a trumpet like we think of a trumpet. And it doesn't sound like a trumpet either. The sound produced by a shofar is not very pleasant or musical, but it is most definitely loud and intimidating, especially when several are played at once. It's possible that the Canaanites, who were not shepherds like the Israelites, had never even heard such instruments before. And it probably would have sounded to them like an air raid siren, something loud and disturbing and unnerving. It would have definitely gotten their attention. And what would they have done? Well, they would have rushed to the walls to see what was going on. I'm sure they would have been bewildered by what they saw. This massive group of soldiers marching and surrounding the city, a few guys blowing these screechy trumpets, and nothing else. Silence. No chants, no warrior songs, no battle cry, no talking. Not even a lieutenant shouting orders. Nothing. Except the creepy wail of the shofars and a sea of soldiers. That must have been pretty eerie. To be hit with such a feeling of dread and a sense of foreboding, and then nothing? The people of Jericho, I think, must have watched that first march in a state of high alert, right? Bracing themselves for an attack which they expected to begin imminently. But then, nothing happened. The army just marched around the city and went away. What was going on? And why would God accomplish this military victory in such a weird way? If he wanted the walls of Jericho to fall down, why didn't he just blow them down with a strong wind? Or send an earthquake to knock them over? Why draw things out for 7 days with this crazy, unorthodox marching? Well, I don't think God is ever only doing one thing. So he might have had several different reasons why he used these methods. But I think he was working in this way, at least, both to exercise the faith of his own people and to give the people of Jericho the opportunity to surrender. God wasn't just out to destroy the city of Jericho for the purposes of destroying Jericho. He was out to make himself known to the nations of the world and offer them the benefits and blessings of becoming his people. And hadn't he already made himself known in a big way? If you're reading along in the book of Joshua this month, as I encourage you to do, and stay afterwards to ask all your questions at the Bible study, if you're reading along, you've probably already come to chapter 2, where Rahab, who lived in Jericho, saved the lives of 2 Israelite spies. And after she had hidden them, she said this. I didn't tell you what to put up the slide, but you can put it up now. Thank you. I know, she said, I know that the Lord has given you this land. We are all afraid of you. Everyone in the land is living in terror. For we have heard how the Lord made a dry path for you through the Red Sea when you left Egypt. And we know what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 Amorite kings east of the Jordan River, whose people you completely destroyed. No wonder our hearts have melted in fear. No one has the courage to fight after hearing such things. For the Lord your God is the supreme God of the heavens above and the earth below. Wow, talk about evangelism. God had embarked on an advertising campaign to introduce himself to Pharaoh back in the land of Egypt. But as a result of the events that happened there, the word had already spread throughout Canaan about the Hebrews and their God. As the Israelites wandered around for a while, many of the Canaanites were smart and left them alone. But Sihon and Og, the 2 Amorite kings east of the Jordan River, had decided to attack Israel instead, and they ended up being utterly destroyed. Now, I'm sure sure that that only added to the fear and terror that the other nations were experiencing. Anybody who had dared to go up against this people and their God had been wiped out. Would they be next? And here's Rahab saying that nobody has the courage to fight, that all their hearts have melted in fear. But what will the king of Jericho do when the army of God shows up? Will he surrender? Will he even try to negotiate? No. For 6 days, the Israelites display their military might without aggression, but there's no response. The people might be afraid, but it seems they're unwilling to yield. Well, not all of them. Rahab was not unwilling, was she? She had heard the stories. She knew everything the king knew, yet she was willing to take a chance that her kindness to the spies would be repaid with mercy. Along with the stories about the destruction of Egypt, perhaps she heard that there were thousands of Egyptians who were willing to join the ranks of the Israelites and who had come out with God's people. And so they were allowed to do just that. Perhaps she reasoned then that God wasn't just out to destroy the Egyptians, but that he was in the business of confronting those who wouldn't listen. Whatever it was, it's obvious that Rahab was willing to surrender to the God of the Israelites. She was willing to leave behind the life she had known and chart a new course with a new God. And that's all it took. A simple willingness to submit, to listen, to be led. She gathered into her house all those who were also willing to leave the ruins of Jericho behind and have a fresh start in Israel, and they were spared from the destruction that came on the seventh day. And not only was Rahab spared, she was highly honored in Israel as a woman of great faith, mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11, and also as a direct ancestor in the lineage of Christ. From a prostitute in Jericho to a progenitor of the Messiah. Now that's quite a transformation. And all it took was her willingness. Incidentally, I think the weirdo military tactics God was using there at Jericho were testing the willingness of Israel as well. Would they listen to God's instructions? Would they trust him to take down the walls as he said, when he said? Would they keep returning day after day, probably feeling like idiots as they marched around the city and then went home? Would they do what God said? Were they willing to be led by him, even when there was no earthly reason why they should do things in the way they were doing them? Will we do what God says? Will we be willing to be led by him, even when there's no earthly reason why we should do things in the way we are being asked to do them? Willingness. That's all God needs. That is the teeny tiny mustard seed with which God is able to move whole mountains. If he has our willingness, there's nothing he cannot accomplish in and through us. If he doesn't have our willingness, there's nothing he can accomplish in or through us. In a way, we are like the inhabitants of Jericho, who have spent years building various walls of differing thickness and heights around our hearts. And God comes to present himself to us, just as he brought the Israelites to Jericho. There's time to consider our options. He always gives us plenty of time. But what will our decision be? Will we keep the gates locked up tight? Will we attack? Will we surrender? Will we hope he just goes away? God is no respecter of persons. He doesn't care where you've come from, or how much wealth or education you have. He doesn't have one set of standards for some people and a different set of standards for others. Wherever he finds them, God works with the willing, because our willingness is what opens the door to his ability to work. As long as the Israelites were willing to listen, God was able to work through them. When they became unwilling to listen, they found themselves surrounded by a heathen nation and carried off into captivity. So it's not like being born at the right place or the right time or into the right family or nation is what puts you in God's good graces. God has good graces for everyone. And those who will receive them are those who are willing. Are you?